Okay, well, let's start with just a little bit of an introduction. Um, I watched a few weeks ago. I started watching uh, a fascinating, like a travel blog um, from Brooklyn, of all places, and um, and it was very interesting because it went into three different Orthodox Jewish communities. And the Orthodox Jews are also known as the Hasidim or Hasidic Jews. And they are the ones when you go to New York or to Israel, so you'll see them in their traditional like 19th, 18th century garb, the big hats and the curls. And so it was a fascinating introduction like to this community. And what I found very interesting too is that within Orthodox Judaism there is a great messianic hope. The coming of the Messiah is a big theme for them, and that's one of the reasons why I think they try to read the signs using scripture, using the prophets. They try to read different signs. So, for example, I remember maybe about 20 years ago, there was a calf was born in Israel that was a not normal color, and that was taken as a sign. And Hasidic Jews were looking at this as some sort of what does this mean? When is the Messiah coming? And Hasidic Jews also have had various leaders, rabbis, who they have thought of as being messiahs. And it's very interesting because um, we see that much more present amongst the Orthodox Jews than other branches of Judaism. It's still there, but you could say almost within Hasidic Judaism, it is almost an obsession. Now, why is it important to bring this up? Well, because we are reading the same books. We are looking at the prophet Isaiah as having spoken about the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Jesus, the incarnation, and having spoken about that some 700 years before Christ. And Isaiah is one of the many prophets that Hasidic Jews are also reading and trying to understand and trying to figure out. Now, they also have, there are other texts within Judaism that inform their approach to the Messiah, whereas these texts are not used commonly by Christians, mainly by biblical scholars who may refer to them, like the writings that you might come across, like the Babylonian Talmud, which is 500 BC, or the Peshitta, which is a text of Aramaic Talmud, you can say, very similar. So these writings are not part of what we read, but they're part of what Judaism looks at to inform their messianic hope. And so it is important to look at some of these prophets. And tonight we're only going to look at Isaiah. We're going to look at enough of Isaiah to get an appreciation for a bigger picture, and hopefully enough for you to, at home, open up the Old Testament and read from Isaiah. And also, when you listen to, during this holiday season, you listen to Handel's Messiah, so some of the words will take on, I hope, a different and perhaps deeper meaning. Now, today we celebrate in the Byzantine Church and in the Orthodox churches, we celebrate the feast of the Conception by Saint Anne, which is basically the same feast that is celebrated in the Roman Catholic Church on the 8th, yesterday. The difference is that there is a little bit of a different focus. We focus on Mary as well as her parents. And within the Roman tradition, the focus is much more about the person of Mary. And it jumps a little bit forward into the rest of Mary's life. And so we're looking at the same mystery from two different perspectives, I would say. We're also listening already to texts in the services, especially in the hours, the monastic hours, that talk about what we are preparing to celebrate. And so we're going to begin with some of the texts as prayer, some of the texts from the monastic hours for the Feast of the Nativity and the pre-Feast of the Nativity. And I picked out specifically one about Mary, since this is these feasts of the Conception by Anna, the Immaculate Conception, are feasts that are Marian feasts. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Behold, the Virgin, as was said of old, has conceived in her womb, and has brought forth God as a man. Yet she remains still a virgin. Being reconciled to God through her, let us sinners sing her praise, for truly she is Theotokos. How is he contained in a womb whom nothing can contain? How can he be held in the arms of his mother, who remains forever in the bosom of his Father? It is according to his good will, as he knows and as he desires. For being without flesh, he of his own good will has been made flesh. And he who is, has for our sake become what he was not. He has shared our nature without departing from his own. Desiring to fill the world on high with citizens, Christ has undergone a twofold birth. He who before the morning star was begotten of the Father without a mother, is made flesh on earth today without a father from you. A star announces the glad tidings to the wise men, while angels with shepherds sing the praises of your childbearing without corruption, O you who are full of grace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So I chose these verses specifically because we hear firstly that as was said of old, the Virgin has conceived in her womb. That's, of course, from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And then at the very end, the last verse makes reference to Mary's state when the angel came to her and said, full of grace, which of course is one of the basic formulations that expresses the reality of Mary being prepared in a special way. So what is called the Immaculate Conception in the Roman Catholic Church. And that preparation is beautifully mentioned also. So we find both of these themes are woven in. So let's begin to look at this prophet Isaiah. And, it is very important for us to understand that the prophets, although they may seem somehow as being on the side or a reality that is not really important. I mean, when have we been taught that we should be reading from the prophets? When have we looked at the prophets as saints? It's a very interesting, difficult relationship that Christianity has with the Old Testament, and then with some of these individuals. And because we see them as being pre-Christian, so somehow disconnected. The Old Testament is a mysterious book, very difficult to read and understand. A lot of it seems to not necessarily be in reference to Jesus. And so at best, we know some of the stories that are part of our childhood. So some of the, Adam and Eve, we know about David and Goliath. You may have learned about Joshua, and there's some nice little songs for kids that we sing, like about Joshua. And of course, we know about Moses because of probably more because of the epic film, the Ten Commandments, than because we actually read about it in the Old Testament. So this is the extent of the relationship that we have with the Old Testament. And I'd like to first begin with the fact that the prophet Isaiah is considered a saint. He is on the church's calendar of saints, as are most of the prophets. Obviously, some of the more colorful characters are not. But this prophet specifically, Isaiah, is very important because he is the one who is most quoted in the New Testament. And very often the quoting doesn't recognize him. It's actually been biblical scholars who have matched up words and expressions and ideas that have been lifted from Isaiah, some verbatim using the same terminology, and others using paraphrase. But Isaiah is, you could say, directly mentioned in the New Testament some 70 times. No other Old Testament prophet has that type of a quotability. And so Isaiah as a person is very important. He is really essential if we want to understand who the Messiah is and why the coming of the Messiah is so important. We can't really disconnect from Isaiah. So he is, let's start with how he is referred to. Within Christianity, he is referred to as the Messianic prophet. He is the prophet who is most speaks about the Messiah. And then, of course, there are the fulfillment of these prophecies which we find in Jesus. But prophet is not necessarily just someone who is a seer. So although he is telling about the future, he is looking forward to the fulfillment of the promised Messiah, the prophet is also addressing issues in his own time. And so, it is kind of a balancing between the social situations, the religious consequences, the spiritual state of the people where he is sent, as well as the future hope. Now, the understanding prophet within Hebrew, the word prophet is nabi. The word prophet is it is a noun that is created out of a verb that means to boil like a fountain. So kind of like a geyser. And so as in Judaism, there is a lot in Hebrew. There is a lot of naming using the action. We heard about that with the angels. We heard about that with some of God's own names that have to do with what he does as opposed to who he is. And so in the same way, prophet is one who brings this message which just surges as a geyser. And so Isaiah comes into an interesting period. So let's just get a little bit of a timeline. The prophet's activity is from about the year 740 BC to 690 BC. Remember, we're counting backwards. So his activity is rather long. We know that at the time he was around, Israel was divided. So the people, the tribes of Israel, were divided into two kingdoms. The kingdom of Israel, that was roughly about 10 tribes, and then the kingdom of Judah, which was 2 tribes. And so they had their own kings, they had the same religion, and Jerusalem was kind of on the border between the 2 kingdoms. Judah is the kingdom of the south. So those of you who are familiar with the Holy Land know that south of Jerusalem, that area goes right into the desert, whereas the kingdom of Israel goes up into the Galilee, which is like a very fertile valley. Also, just for a little bit of a chronology, so Abraham, the great Abraham, the father of nations, so he lived from about 1973 to 1638 BC. So that's the rough period as far as timing him out. So that is, we're talking about 1,000 years before Isaiah. King David was from 1040 to 970 BC. And so that is roughly 300 years before Isaiah. And so that kind of gives a little bit of an idea of the distance chronologically between these different personalities of the Old Testament. The Babylonian exile comes after Isaiah. Babylonian exile is from around 598 to 538 BC. And Isaiah is also connected to Babylonian exile because he predicts it as one of the consequences of the problems that the rulers are causing. So Isaiah, his name literally is translated as the Lord is salvation. In Hebrew, the names we have, so they're kind of Hellenic, so Greek and Latin forms of the original name. In Hebrew, his name is Yeshayahu. Doesn't sound even close to Isaiah, but that's what happens when things are translated and transliterated. His name, though, means salvation of the Lord, or the Lord is salvation. And again, his name is telling us about what he does. So it actually is a name which which describes his prophetic activity and is symbolic of his message. He is said to be the son of Amos, not Amos from the Bible, Amos, A-M-O-Z. And Amos is also thought to be the brother of Amaziah, who was the king of Judah. So, and that's an important tidbit of information, because when we read Isaiah, so he seems to be remarkably in the know about what is going on in these kingdoms. And while, we could say, well, God is informing him and, leading him, there's no doubt that he was connected high up. And blood connections, family connections are the best way to understand and explain why he was so political and why he seemed to know what the general leanings of the kings were. And so we know that his visions came in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Those 4 kings were the kings while he was prophesying. Uzziah literally was basically, we guess he was probably already on his way out, if not had already died. So he was in that period where Uzziah died and the next King Jotham was appointed. And then he ends his life under King Manasseh. And Manasseh had just ascended the throne, and Isaiah begins a series of prophecies, but also directives against the rule of Manasseh. And Manasseh's rule was already corrupted, very much leaning towards foreign nations and foreign religions. And so with that happening, the prophet, according to Jewish tradition, so this is not specific to the Christian tradition. However, according to Jewish tradition, it is said that he was under Manasseh sawn in two. And so he was killed as prophet. And this does go back, this does reflect what Jesus mentions about the prophets and what we hear then reiterated also in the epistles of St. Paul about the prophets having suffered even death. And so Isaiah is one of those that does suffer death, although it is preserved within Jewish tradition. So what happens? Let's take a look at a map just to give you a little bit of a information to understand. So firstly, this is kind of a general layout of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is approximately 400 years before Isaiah. But you get a little bit of an idea as far as where the traditional territories of each tribe were. And if you look at the top, you'll see Zebulun and Naphtali. And those two tribes are specifically mentioned in Isaiah's predictions, prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. And then at the bottom, we'll see Judah. And you can see in the very middle, there's the little area that is the tribe of Benjamin. And within Benjamin's tribe, there we can see also Jerusalem within Benjamin's territory. But and so eventually that will be the dividing line between the northern kingdom and then the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom will be called Israel. The southern kingdom will be called Judah. And then from the time of Isaiah, we can see here the actual layout of the two kingdoms and what was under their jurisdiction. The main issue was that the kingdoms of the Assyrian kingdom was in massive expansion, was a very powerful kingdom, and it was slowly taking over other lands. They conquered the Phoenicians, they conquered different tribes, and they were coming to Judah, and well, they were threatening first Israel, the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom decided to band together with the kingdom of Syria, and that this way they would have a treaty, and this treaty would protect them from the Assyrian threat. The Assyrians, that was also the capital of Assyria was Babylonia. So it was the enemy to be feared, and Israel decides to create this treaty in the hopes that somehow it would be safe. What happens is that that Isaiah, when he begins his prophecy, he begins by pointing to the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, even though that is not where he is prophesying. He is in Judah. But the kingdom of Judah is watching the development of this treaty and considering doing something similar. And so Isaiah comes to them and he begins this this argument with the court that they should only focus on their relationship with God, and that coming into an alliance with a non-Jewish nation that is not a part of the tribes of Israel will mean that they do not have faith in God, and it will cost them dearly. It will lead to their exile. And this is where Isaiah begins to point specifically to the exile, to Babylonian exile. And so we get in chapter 8 of the prophecy of Isaiah, we begin to hear there about specifically what is going to happen. And he presents to them the question. He says, you have the choice, and the choice is the Lord or Assyria. The king is considering that perhaps in order to not be flooded and overrun and not be brought under the Assyrians, as Israel and Syria were, he is considering making some sort of a peace treaty or deal with the Assyrians. And this is where Isaiah says very clearly, make no alliances and trust only in the Lord. Now, King Hezekiah, he actually decided to listen to Isaiah. And during the rule of Hezekiah, there is peace. And his faith, the faith of Hezekiah, becomes noted, and the kingdom of Judah is not only protected, but it thrives, and the Assyrians do not destroy it. Hezekiah then has a moment where he becomes proud that he was able to keep his kingdom, and he shows the ambassadors of Babylonia, he shows them his treasury. So they see how much money he has, which later on comes back at the kingdom of Judah. They end up having to pay a lot because it is now known what they have. And so that is considered, like, that is the sin of Hezekiah, where he, for that brief moment, becomes proud of his accomplishments as king, not recognizing that everything that has happened by the grace of God. And so Isaiah continues his entire prophetic ministry is one of explaining and teaching to the court, primarily working with the kings, about who is God, and that one in the kingdom must trust in the Holy One of Israel, must wait upon the Lord. And then he also reveals to the people of Judah the designations, the names, what to call God, Yahweh. He calls him the Lord of hosts 62 times. He also, the hosts that he's referring to are understood as being the angelic powers, but at the time of Isaiah, the hosts were probably understood as the armies of Judah, as those who were actually defending the kingdom of Judah. He also calls Yahweh the Holy One of Israel 25 times, whereas that specific title appears only 6 times in the rest of the Old Testament. And he also pronounces in a prophetic manner the judgment of God against Judah and against Jerusalem. And then he portrays God as being the judge, he who judges not only Israel. When I say Israel, I don't mean the northern kingdom, I mean the 12 tribes. But he also judges heathen nations. The Lord judges the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Medes. And so his importance is as much as revealing God's plan to the kingdom and the king of Judah in order for them to truly grow as the people of God, that God would in fact protect them, that God guides them, that God defends them. And so the importance of Isaiah as far as understanding who this God of Israel is, when we read from the prophecy of Isaiah, we understand then the importance of the Messiah. That why in the midst of all of these 2 kingdoms that are not being well administered, that have ups and downs, the Messiah is the hope of the people. He is the one who God will send when the people of Israel are prepared. And that preparation is not happening under Isaiah's term as prophet. And that's why he's prophesying, because he sees that the people of Israel are falling far short. And they're putting more faith in their own resources, their own plans, their own treaties, than they are in the plan of God. Then Isaiah also strengthens, through his prophecy, he strengthens the people's hope in God. That God ultimately is in control of all things. That God is the one who protects. That God is the one who makes the decisions about his people that he has called to himself. Then Isaiah also trying to, through his prophetic ministry, inspire love for God, devotion to God, and then create within the people not only a hope for the coming of the Messiah, but also a love for the figure of the Messiah, so that when he would come, he would be recognized. And then he also reveals to the people that as God exercises through his directives to the prophet, exercises his authority over the people, over Israel, so too the Messiah will exercise his authority when he comes to rule, when he comes to fulfill that messianic hope. And so the focus for us, this is, I think, where some of the Old Testament history becomes a little convoluted, because we're hearing in the Old Testament, we hear about the forming of a nation. We hear about God's plan, how he takes this people that he calls unto himself, and he takes from Jacob, who we also refer to as Israel, from his 12 sons come the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we hear about this forming. After all, the Old Testament is the story of a nation. It is the story of a relationship between God and the people of Israel. And then it is also the story of how he perfects them, how he, you could say, chastises them even. And, this is one of the things that I think sometimes is difficult for us to understand, coming from a Christian perspective. When you read the Old Testament, you hear about God being quite harsh and severe, and he doesn't quite seem to be like God the Father is in the New Testament for Jesus. That Jesus reveals to us a God who seems to have mellowed, that somehow he is not as the Old Testament God was. But I think in order to understand, God doesn't change. God is completely consistent. And these parts of him, these attributes of him, which in the Old Testament we see his severity, his rigidity, his justice, they come in a specific context. So if we're looking at the Old Testament as this time of formation, of growth, where the people of Israel are brought together kind of like a child. And so they're being nurtured. They are just beginning their life as a people under God. And so, just like when we're raising children, with children, you have to not only love them, but you also need to correct them. You need to chastise, you need to punish. The aspect of love is not just about love, but it's a balancing of those qualities which will grow for you a child to be proud of. And so I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing God who is nurturing his people and challenging them and reprimanding them. But ultimately, he is faithful to them. He is always with them. He gives them what they need. He fulfills his promises. And so the reason behind God being like that in the Old Testament is actually one that I think we can understand. And so when the Messiah comes at what biblically is referred to as the fullness of time. And so the people of Israel have, you could say, grown up. They are now mature. They are now ready. They have established their relationship with God, and they are faithful to God. They know him in a way that they didn't millennia earlier. And so Jesus comes then and reveals to the people, beginning with the people of Israel. After all, that is where he begins his ministry. He begins by revealing to them God who is Father, God who is loving, compassionate. He is still the same God of the Old Testament. That is all still a part of him. But it is now time for the people to see this relationship with God from a different perspective. You know, I sometimes think about, like, you know, when you have the episodes with a small child, you know, who turns to you and says, you know, as the parent says, "I hate you." You know, and you get that kind of fighting back, you know, for control and whatever. The words are out of anger. They're not necessarily, I won't say empty, but they are, they have some emotion to them. But the parent continues to love. And, you know, as the relationship grows, as the child becomes an adult, the relationship then takes on a different form. And so those kinds of words and actions of rebelliousness, you know, when the child is younger, you know, that just becomes a memory of the past. And now the relationship is different. And so, you know, I think it's very similar with the relationship that God has with his people in the time of Jesus. It's come to a different place. Now, the understanding, of course, is still there that God does chastise, God does punish. And for example, the different Jewish theological, rabbinical schools, they interpret also the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of any Jewish control over the Holy Land as being a chastisement. And so some of the rabbis will say, for example, that, you know, the reason why Jerusalem was destroyed was because too many Jews had become influenced by the Roman and Greek way of living. And they were no longer faithful to the people of Israel. They were no longer living right. So that's always there, that chastisement is a present thought within Judaism. Now, but looking at specifically the hope, because this is for us, although we get a context out of the Old Testament and out of Isaiah, and we can understand his harsh words for the people of Judah, for the king of Judah, for us, the most important thing is to look at the person of the Messiah. And so there are a couple of things to understand. Firstly, that what we read about in chapter 8, and that is all of the gloom and anguish and punishment, all of that will end. And Isaiah at the end mentions that the northern tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali will be honored. But he also mentions that heathen Galilee, and that's that's one of those. I have here two translations. So in the New American Bible, the wording is, where once he degraded the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, now he has glorified the way of the sea, the land across the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. And that's a rather poetic translation. And here, this is translation directly from the Hebrew. Now the former hath lightly afflicted the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but the latter hath dealt a more grievous blow by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan in the district of the nations. And the Hebrew translation doesn't even mention Galilee. And see, and that is one of the differences where Galilee becomes important, because that is connected to the Messiah. And so in the Hebrew text, the word Galilee is not used. They describe the area without calling it Galilee, and possibly it may have been removed, because it is found in some of the earlier scrolls. Like, we will find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but because of the association with Jesus coming from Galilee, Jesus of Nazareth, which is in the Galilee, even though he was born in Bethlehem, that doesn't matter, because it is the place where he is from that he is connected to. And his parents lived in Nazareth and then returned to Nazareth. And so Galilee is a part of his literally DNA. And this is important in Isaiah, that Galilee is mentioned, because it is kind of out there. It's one of those random details that is not just coincidental. And Galilee in the Old Testament, and even in the time of Jesus, had gotten a bad reputation. It was an area that was mixed, where there were many people who were not Jewish, who were not from the 12 tribes. And so it was not necessarily the holiest part of the Holy Land. And, and of course, remember the wonderful phrase, what good can come from Galilee? That is one of those questions that was a state of mind. It was a reality amongst the Jews. And then the other thing, when we read about Isaiah's prophecies about the Messiah, so even though he is prophesying what will come, his verbs in the original Hebrew are all in the past tense. And that's kind of an interesting detail, which in a way, it's done consistently. So he doesn't like change tenses. He doesn't jump to future. He's always speaking about the prophecies as the past. And perhaps I think that also reveals his mindset. Since God revealed to him what will happen, then Isaiah recognizes that God does not change his mind. It is set. So it is, you could say, as good as done. And so it's an intentional use of that tense. And so he presents to us then, this is starting in chapter 9 of the prophecy. There are a number of themes that are important in revealing something about this Messiah. You know, who is this Messiah? So firstly, the Messiah brings joy and prosperity. And he begins by the understanding he is going to dispel darkness. He will bring light. And he doesn't really express how this will happen or when it will happen, but the age of the coming of the Messiah, which is coming in the future, will be joyful. It will be as a harvest. And we can read that looking at verse 3. And this is interesting too, these little details here. Because after having spoken very specifically about all the doom and gloom and warfare and captivity, as well as all of the suffering that the people will go through. So in chapter 9, he begins with, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Upon those who lived in a land of gloom, a light has shone. You have brought them abundant joy and great rejoicing. So that's specific right there. The coming of the Messiah brings abundant joy and great rejoicing. They rejoice before you as people who rejoice at the harvest, as they exult when dividing the spoils. Now, the spoils is a reference to warfare and to having successfully conquered and plundered. So it's interesting that he puts together right there, it juxtaposes a peacetime activity, which is harvest. If you're at war, you're not, planting and reaping. You're rather setting up to protect what you do have. So he sets that up, the harvest, but also he recognizes wartime spoil and plunder. And then he says, continuing in this theme, for the yoke that burdened them, the pole on their shoulder, the rod of their taskmaster, you have smashed. And this is specifically referring to captivity, to when they were captives in Babylon. And so the yoke is what the harness that is put on cattle, for the tilling of ground. And the pole on their shoulder is a reference to the rod that is used to strike animals to get them moving. And then you have smashed these as on the day of Midian. For every boot that trampled in battle, every cloak rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for fire. So those things that are the remnants and memories of wartime, the boots, as well as the cloaks, that will be burned. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. Upon his shoulder, dominion rests. And this is here, they name him Wonder Counselor, God Hero, Father forever, Prince of Peace. Now, this section, this long list is not, if you look it up in the Bible, they're all capitalized because, again, these are names. These are the names of God. They describe God and what he is doing. In the English translation of the Hebrew text, because of the holiness of any words that are names of God or attributes of God, so they actually put in here, and his name is called, and then there is the long list all in Hebrew. Because it's considered to be, since it is the prophets giving God names, so they're not adjectives, but these are proper nouns. These are his names. So it is considered holy, and that can only be uttered in the language of God, which is Hebrew. And so that's why even in my handy little translation of scriptures that is from Half Price Books, a book that some kid received for his bar mitzvah and then sold it off. But hey, I got a nice English translation of Jewish scriptures out of it, so that's okay. It's interesting to do some of the comparison. The word that does not appear where we read in English, we read, they call him Wonder Counselor, God Hero. The word God does not appear. That's the one word that is different. And it is not known why that appears. It does appear in, I guess, in Hebrew scriptures in the Greek text. So, but not in the Hebrew scriptures in the Hebrew original. And, there are different theories as to why God, that simple word, would appear there. Probably the main one is that because Isaiah is speaking about the Messiah, and there is a kind of a blurry line between him being God or not being God. And Isaiah does this on purpose. We find that a few times when he speaks, he talks about the Messiah, and then he switches to God. And so we're not sure. And of course, that lends itself beautifully to realizing in Christ that humanity and divinity meet in him. And so he is Messiah and he is also God. And so it makes sense for us when we read it with a Christian mindset, whereas not quite the same when you're looking at it from a Jewish perspective, still waiting for the coming of the Messiah and the fulfillment of the prophecy. The other theme that is also very important here is that a part of the joy that the Messiah brings has to do with the cessation of war, that war is no longer a reality. And that is one of the themes that we find echoed in the prophecy of Isaiah over and over again. Because if you remember at the beginning, Isaiah's issue with the kings of Judah was that they sought to control their reign through different diplomatic efforts, peace treaties, paying of tributes to larger kingdoms next door. They negotiated things through ambassadors and through politics. And this is the peace that comes with the Messiah, a peace that does not require negotiation, a peace that does not compromise the integrity of the people or the faith of the people. Because what happens to Israel and Judah is that they end up being contaminated by foreign religions and foreign cultures. You know, think about the reality of like the Samaritans. The Samaritans in the midst of the people of Israel were this reminder of what happens when you don't have faith in God and you compromise and make treaties and alliances with foreign powers that then corrupt your religion. And that was the Samaritans were a corruption of Jewish faith and practice, and also a corruption of the Jewish bloodline, because they were not from the 12 tribes. And so, and that's, you know, those are things which are still important today. So like, you know, in going to, someone wants to immigrate to Israel, for example, you have the right of return. If you are of Jewish background, you have the right of return, meaning you can prove your Jewish ancestry, so you can go and become a citizen of Israel. And many groups have come forward and have claimed that they have Jewish ancestry, and literally DNA tests are done to make sure that this is in fact true. And so some peoples, like for example, some of the Jewish tribes of Ethiopia, there are some which have a clear Jewish connection, and there are some that don't. And so, so through the DNA, they try to figure things out. And then the tribes that were didn't have the DNA, so they had to wait. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, Israeli court ruled that since they are Jewish in full observance religiously, and persecuted for that in Ethiopia, that they do also have the right of return, even though they don't have the DNA. And Samaritans, you know, the Samaritans who were the quintessential outsiders in the time of Jesus, they actually today are considered fully Jewish. And however, you don't have many who are surviving. They've mixed with the Jewish population, and so there really isn't a thing as a pure Samaritan at this point. And so those are, but that was the importance of having that connection, and that's also one of the reasons why for the coming of the Messiah, you know, we're going to have the reading of gospel stories that talk about Jesus's genealogy. And you know, and while it is an opportunity for the priest or the deacon to test his ability at reading off Hebrew names, you know, you kind of listen to it nicely without understanding why, other than recognizing a few names in the genealogy. But that was essential for the early Judeo-Christian church, because they needed to know where Jesus came from and was Jesus fully Jewish. One of the earliest controversies in Christianity and Christianity's relationship with Judaism comes from the 2nd century, and that was when some of the rabbinical authors said that Jesus was actually the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier and Mary. So they kept Mary, and and interestingly enough, I mean, Judaism is passed on the woman's side, so that would render him Jewish anyway. But they knew that in order for him to be this messianic figure, that his background needed to be dirtied. And that was one way of doing it, because of course, any relationship of any sort with a Gentile, a non-Jew, was forbidden. And so in the time of Jesus, you wouldn't have that contact. And so those little details, like for example, we read about, when it comes to Jesus's trial, when he is brought before Pontius Pilate. And so the high priests who come and talk to Pilate, they won't enter his house. So they will stay out, and Pilate comes out to speak to them, because they know that if they go into the building, they will be impure. And so those kinds of concepts, the contact with Gentiles was minimal, and the bloodline, the background, was everything. And so the Messiah had to be from a noble bloodline. Joseph is important because Joseph is, while we know that God the Father is the father of Jesus Christ. And so Joseph is a adoptive father, and his presence is important because of legitimacy, that Jesus has both father and mother according to Jewish law. And Joseph, when he declares his paternity over Jesus, and this would happen on the 7th day when Jesus was circumcised. And so Joseph would declare that he is the father of the child, and by adoption, Jesus receives Joseph's entire heritage. And that's very important because both Mary and Joseph are connected to King David. And so in a sense, they are both royal. They are from a bloodline that has been blessed by God. And that becomes also very important because David is a key figure for the fulfillment of this messianic hope. And when we continue reading on in Isaiah in chapter 9, so Isaiah does express a condemnation over the northern kingdom and what the northerners have done. Because the southern kingdom was, Hezekiah tried. They tried to maintain their relationship and faithfulness with God, but the northerners were unstoppable. They were ambitious. They had their own plans. And so Isaiah writes very strong words. The Lord has sent a word against Israel, and it falls upon Israel, and all the people know it. Ephraim and those who dwell in Samaria, those who say in arrogance and pride of heart, bricks have fallen, but we will rebuild with cut stone. Sycamores have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars. So the Lord raises up their foes against them. So basically saying, well, even though you're rebuilding, and very ambitiously so, your enemies are still there. You're still going to be destroyed. And the Lord is going to permit that. And it says here, and then the list goes on. The Philistines in the west, the Aramites in the east, they devour Israel with open mouth. And so the prophecy is, while we just read about the coming of the Messiah, we also see what the problem is. So even though the kingdom of Israel was the bigger kingdom, because it had the 10 tribes as opposed to Judah, there was only 2 tribes, there was nothing for Judah to be jealous of, because Israel was doomed by its very arrogance and all of the ways it has compromised on its relationship with God. And so the coming of the Messiah then for the people of Israel, and this is a prophecy for all 12 tribes, even though the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, is ignoring God. The coming of the Messiah is done alone by the hand of God. And so this is the reason, one of the reasons why the use of the word son, the filial connection to God, is very important, because it connects God to the Messiah in a way that reflects David, because David is also called as king. He is called Son of God. But it also establishes that the relationship between God and the Messiah is not just a political leader, not just someone who is chosen to rule over the people, but rather someone who is intimately connected to the plan of God, to the very essence of God, who is Father. And so that relationship is deeper than just some leader or politician. The government will be upon his shoulders. They're beautiful expressions that are a little difficult to unpack, but Isaiah is using this juxtaposition between earlier in chapter 9, he refers to the yoke of slavery as being that which takes away life. And here the Messiah being the one who carries governance, not as a yoke, but rather as freedom, as something that ensures justice, something that is no longer subject to human terms and agreements. And then the Messiah, this title, which is also I think a very beautiful one, is the Wonderful Counselor, which we hear also in the 8th chapter in this list of titles. Titling in the Old Testament is done in Psalms, it is done in coronation hymns. And so giving these titles tells us about the actions of the Messiah. Wonderful Counselor is a difficult English term because wonderful in English means great. You say like, have a wonderful day. It's a very kind of a way of expressing a certain sentiment. Wonderful means wonders, miracles, unexplained things. And so it is stating about this Messiah that there are happenings that have no explanation that are associated with him. And in the Hebrew term, is in a literal translation means extraordinary or possessing supernatural capabilities. That's wonderful. Counselor, again, counsel, I mean, that's like a advisor. Then you think of high school counselors and college counselors, and in English, again, it doesn't render the word. The Hebrew word means one who plans. And so you've got this person, the one who plans is the one who has the wisdom to rule. So it's explaining this focus on his capability to be wise in governing and in decision making. And this, of course, we see this beautifully echoed in Jesus. All of these terms, applying them to how Jesus governs, rules, his focus on justice, his focus on compassion. So all of these we read, and we have to keep in mind this is speaking about the person of the Messiah, who for us is Jesus Christ. And so we recognize all of this in the words. And then the term mighty, and we say with the English translation, we say God, hero. The word, again, the use of the word God is not universal in the Hebrew scriptures, but it is a term that loosely can be translated as God, but it also refers to a judge or a king. So not the same as not having the same impact. I would say it's a little watered down in that sense. However, when one expresses in Hebrew might, the might and power, the Hebrew terminology refers to absolute might. So absolute strength. And it is a strength that cannot come from someone who is not God. And so that's why I think that the translation into Greek and Latin has looked at the word God as being the most correct. And Isaiah does use also the same term, which is based just two letters, El. He uses this word when he uses the word Emmanuel. And so Emmanuel means God with us. And so it's not, just a mighty leader with us. It's not a judge with us, but it's God. And so we can infer that God, hero, or mighty God is probably the way that Isaiah would actually see it. And then he's also referred to as, I have in this edition, the American Bible, it says, Father forever. Sometimes translated as everlasting Father. And this is an interesting term because it is a term that in Hebrew would be more descriptive of God, who is referred to in Hebrew scriptures also as the Father of ages or Ancient of Days. And so these titles, it carries a force that would indicate that the Messiah, although he's not the Father, has many of the same characteristics of God the Father. And then the other title, the last one, is Prince of Peace. And, peace is a greeting that we hear Jesus utter many times when you go to the Holy Land. So that's how people greet each other today in Hebrew. They say shalom. That's very common. And yet, this is a little different. Prince of Peace has a very different connotation because as a prince, so title of governance, and since he is peace and he is government, then it is a peace which is guaranteed by God, by the Messiah. It is a peace that is not just a normal peace that one has, through negotiations and treaties, but rather this is a peace that is everlasting, a peace that is the fruit of the reign of the Messiah, a peace that never ends, a peace that is authentic. And so, that is one of the age, you could say the age of the Messiah, the coming of the kingdom. And, Jesus does speak about that also very often. The kingdom is here. Then the Messiah will reign in righteousness. And this is a reference to the judgment of the Messiah, the judgment over specifically beginning with the people of the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. When we look, I think one of the, there are themes that we can look at that give us a parallel between Isaiah's prophecy and the fulfillment. And so I'll just go through some of this and give you the references so you can look it up. From Isaiah's prophecy, the Messiah will be born of a virgin. And that is Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. And the fulfillment is, we find in Luke, that Jesus was born of a virgin, the Virgin Mary. The Messiah will have a Galilean ministry. And that is Isaiah chapter 9, verse 1 and 2. Jesus's ministry began in Galilee of the Gentiles. And that we find Matthew chapter 4, verse 13. He will be an heir to the throne of David. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 7. Chapter 11, verse 1. And in Luke chapter 1, verse 32 and 33, Jesus is given the throne of his father David. According to Isaiah, the Messiah will have his way prepared. And that is Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. And in John 1, chapter 19, we hear about John the Baptist who prepares the way. He will be spat upon and struck. We find when we read from Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, and that is the reference to the suffering servant, that tells us about the passion of Christ. And we see that in Matthew chapter 26, verse 67, that Jesus was spat on and beaten. He will be disfigured by suffering, Isaiah chapter 52, verse 14. And in Mark chapter 15, verse 15 through 19, he was scourged by Roman soldiers who gave him a crown of thorns. He will make a blood atonement in Isaiah 53, verse 5. And we hear in the first epistle of Peter, he shed his blood to atone for our sins. He will be widely rejected, Isaiah says in chapter 53, and that is echoed in chapter 12 of the Gospel of John. Jesus was not accepted by many. In Isaiah chapter 53, the Messiah will bear our sins and sorrows. And in Romans chapter 4 and in the first letter of Peter, we hear he died because of our sins. He will be our substitute as offering and atonement. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6, and in Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, Jesus Christ died in our place, in our stead. Then the Messiah will voluntarily accept our guilt and punishment for sin. Chapter 53 of Isaiah, verse 7 and 8. And out of the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 29, Jesus took on our sins. The Messiah will be silent before his accusers. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, and the Gospel of Luke chapter 23, verse 9, Jesus was silent before Herod and his court. From Isaiah, he will save us who believe in him. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 12, and John chapter 3, verse 16, he provided salvation for all who believe. From Isaiah, he will heal the brokenhearted. Chapter 61, verse 1 and 2. Luke chapter 4, verse 18 and 19, Jesus heals the brokenhearted. Then from Isaiah chapter 11, verse 2, God's Spirit will rest upon him. And from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 3, verse 16, as well as the Gospel of Mark chapter 1, verse 10, and Luke chapter 3, verse 22, the Spirit of God descended on Jesus. The Messiah will be buried in a rich man's tomb. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 9, and the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 57 to 60. Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph, a rich man from Arimathea. And finally, from the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 11, verse 4 and 5, the Messiah will judge the earth with righteousness. And from the Gospel of John, chapter 5, verse 27, Jesus was given authority to judge. And there are more parallels. I think that's why, reading Isaiah, becoming familiar with his prophecy, and maneuvering a little bit of the historical background that Isaiah is speaking in his time, addressing the problems that he sees right in front of him in his very own kingdom, but he is also speaking about things to come. And so opening up Isaiah, it's not the easiest read. And yet, if you have a good Bible, so, like the New American Bible that has good footnotes, it'll guide you through some of these messianic ideas as well as names, so that you understand where the connections are, so that you don't get lost behind some of the doom and gloom. Isaiah is, not the easiest read, and yet there is something beautiful about seeing so much being said about Jesus, so much that we can clearly see this image of Christ forming from his prophecies about the Messiah. And it is remarkable, both this part, which talks about the coming of the Messiah, as well as then the suffering servant of Isaiah, what we see later on that talks about the passion of Christ. And so this introduction to some of the concepts from Isaiah, and just to open up a little bit of the importance of being familiar with Isaiah, of understanding what the greater context is, that messiahship is not something, we say the word, we talk about Handel's Messiah, but there is a much bigger perspective that we can understand about why the fulfillment of this messianic hope is so important, why the early Christians understood Jesus and the fulfillment of the Messiah a little better perhaps than we do, because they were more rooted in the Old Testament. They were familiar with the prophets. The prophets were the ones who informed and guided the hope of the people of Israel. And then when that fulfillment came, the early church was able to recognize Jesus fully and better because of what had been prophesied about his coming. So, any questions? It's a lot to trudge through because it is it can be a little complex and at times even confusing. I think we hear like Handel's Messiah a lot over this season, and the list of the names is one of the big high points of the entire Messiah, and yet the words don't fully convey some of the gravity of that. The name being assigned to the Messiah, and then how is that interconnected with the person of God? That is such a beautiful revelation of who and what the Messiah brings. The question comes up, well, why has Judaism not recognized the fulfillment of the messianic hope in Jesus? Well, firstly, we have to remember that entire body of the early church, the first Christians, were all Jews. And many Jews did follow Christ. And in some of our previous webinars, I talked about the presence of Judeo-Christians even into the 5th century. In Rome, there were Christian families of Jewish background. And so, so we don't have exact, like numbers or statistics, but definitely the base of the early church, that foundation, was Jewish. What happens after the fall of Jerusalem, and once the Jewish control over the Holy Land is really taken from them, and Romans begin to move people around, and so many Jewish families find themselves in exile. The rabbis come together in the first half of the 2nd century, and they gather in Galilee, of all places, and there they have a gathering, which would be kind of similar to, I guess, a council, for the future guidance of the people of Israel, the people of the Jewish faith. And that their decisions are made that no Nazareans are allowed to be a part of any Jewish community. They cannot come to synagogue. And also that, there we get some of the condemnations about Jesus, that Jesus was not pure, that Jesus was, the bastard child of a Roman legionary. So the wording was made to specifically create a division between Christianity and Judaism. The reality was, at this time, even the Romans, who were running the whole thing, they saw Christianity as being a sect of Judaism. So they still saw there was a connectedness. But it became very important to create that division clearly, because the ones who did not see Jesus as being the Messiah, they made that decision through their own process, and and that is just that is the nature of faith. Not everybody had their eyes opened. Not everyone heard and recognized in Jesus the fulfillment of the messianic hope. No, he did. He wasn't like writing this down. This would have been his disciples who would have been writing what he was prophesying. But he spoke, he taught, and specifically, you can actually see this kind of a change in he's trying to change an attitude, where the people of Israel were more conditioned by fear of God than by love for God. And so, and there's a big difference in that. Consider like our own relationship, let's say, with our parents. It's like, what do you want your kids to take away from that relationship? To fear you or to love you? And so when the motivation is love, then obedience comes easier, because you know that that person who is over you only wants what is best for you. And so it also means nurturing trust. And that's the issue. And I think we struggle with that a lot. I think the way that we relate to God, each one of us has our unique take on that relationship with God. And many people are motivated more by fear. They don't want to go to hell. They fear that God is going to get them in the end. And because it's very difficult to nurture that faith-filled love for God. And, that's what Isaiah is trying to transition the people from one to the other. Because after all, if the kings who Isaiah was speaking with, if they would love God, then they would make the decisions according to that relationship in first place. They wouldn't be looking for treaties and other arrangements with their neighbors who don't care about them, their neighbors who don't love them. And so Isaiah's, he's really coming in strong on just changing the attitude, because change of attitude will mean that their entire reality will change. And so, and it's a message that is in many ways contemporary, because, each one of us has that issue. And, we claim to trust in God's plan. And this was such an important theme that Jesus actually stuck it right into the Our Father, so that we would say, thy will be done. It's not my will be done. And so and we struggle with it. That's, I think it's a recognition of that reality. And Isaiah is working on trying to get that. Now, the interesting thing too is that the Judaism of Jesus's time does see God in a very similar way to the way that Jesus revealed God. The theme of God as Father was very popular, and it is like for Jewish New Year, it is a theme that is repeated in the prayers for both Day of Atonement and for the Jewish New Year. You hear God called Father a lot. And so that relationship, I think, has become a relationship that is more loving. The other thing you think about too is that when a relationship is predicated on fear, so a lot of times, even if the relationship may be friendly and good, not only, fear, we kind of have a tit for tat approach. And it's like, well, when I do this, then I get that. And that's not right either. I remember a few years ago, I went to a symposium at a large synagogue in Pittsburgh. And they had a number of theologians speaking there. And of course, it was also well attended by Christians of different colors. And this rabbi spoke about the relationship with God, and said, basically, this is one of the theological meanderings within Judaism, said, according to what we read in Jewish scripture, we don't really know if there is any afterlife for us. And so, that, of course, that was like complete silence in the synagogue. And right in the front row, this lady raises her hand, and she turns out to be a Roman Catholic nun. And so when she stands up, it's like, uh-oh, here it comes. And she goes, well, if there's no heaven, then why bother following the laws? And the rabbi told her, and I remember this so clearly. The rabbi told her, we follow the laws because God loves us. He loved us out of all peoples on the face of the earth so much. And so we love him back. We follow out of love, not out of obedience. And, it was like, boy, was she quiet. She pulled her veil down and sat down in the front row where she was sitting. And but she also, in her question, she reveals a very human attitude. It's like, well, I'm not gonna eat meat, or I'm gonna go to church on Sunday because I want to make sure that I get to heaven. It's a tit for tat. It's like, it's not like I'm going to church because I need an encounter with Jesus, with God. I need to hear his word. I want to feel the love, and I want to reciprocate with love, and it's, that's what we struggle with. And Isaiah does really, and he's at an early phase where still the people of Israel are a little headstrong. I think according to the chronology, so the people of Israel would be like in their teenage years when Isaiah comes around. And so yeah, they're rebellious. They're hard. They're not easy to bring to a serious, real relationship with God. Relationship that is predicated on love. That's why love figures so big in the Gospel of John. When you want to hear the why did all this happen? First chapter of John. That's right there. And sadly, you have to think, this is not human love. This is an absolute perfect love. This is the origin of love. And so everything that we experience as love is just a shadow of that which God feels and expresses in creation, and then in redemption, and providing the Messiah to save us. So it's it's always that kind of a juxtaposition of what we're familiar with is kind of the knockoff version of the real thing. And so the real thing, we got to remind ourselves of that, because otherwise we run through God and we make him much more human than he ever intended. and that's subject to our fickleness, to our weaknesses, to our failings emotionally, our all of that which is inadequate. And that's not God. God is the origin of it in its purest, unadulterated, absolute form. And so it is perfect. It is not fickle. It does not change. And that's really, Isaiah does also refer to that, those qualities of God, who is consistent, who is forever faithful, who never turns on Israel, even though Israel is, as we see in Isaiah 2, he calls Israel a loose woman. So, but that's a part of, I think we talked about that when it came to like the concept of God as bridegroom to his people Israel, the bride. And so, and again, focusing on God's steadfast stability, and that he does not change. He is not weak. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what it is. It seems that the division of the verses is different in Hebrew scripture than it is in the translations that we see. And this translation ultimately is based on Latin and Greek. And so it's, there is I would say it's a little loose on specifically where the commas fall and where the verses are divided. But I don't have the Orthodox Study Bible here with me. There's nothing in the footnotes that would refer to nothing, really. Yeah, that's It's in my text, it is all hyphenated. So Wonder Counselor, that's name 1. God Hero, name 2. Father Forever, name 3. Prince of Peace, name 4. Yeah, in the Hebrew text that I have here, so it only writes out the names in Hebrew, and it has them as one long word, and but it is all 4. So I suspect that in the Orthodox Study Bible, they may have taken the concept of it being one name, where in English and in other languages it's been redacted into 4 names, and they put it all succinctly into one term. Since in the Hebrew it is, you could say it's essentially one name, even though it has 4 realities being conveyed. That would be my theory on that. I'll have to check that out though, because that's interesting, especially considering these names are so prominent when it comes to the hymnography of the season. You know, we see these terms, these names used in the offices for Christmas, for the Nativity in the Byzantine church. So it is there. So I don't know what kind of a call that was. It really does impoverish the text. And I will have to take a look at that. I wonder though where they got that, because that has to come out of some translation somewhere that perhaps there was a time in the 70s and 80s when there was kind of, in translation, there was a minimalism that was engaged, where they went and took out all the flowery language. They kind of wrote away the adjectives, and it became a very boring story. And but they took away a lot of the flavors, because and I wonder if that's not somehow related to that type of a biblical redaction, which at one time was thought to be the way to do biblical studies. But yeah, that's unfortunate. Yes, it is. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Sabaoth is of hosts. Yeah, actually the Hebrew text, the English translation of Hebrew is exactly the same. Well, and this was, at the time of the early church's growth and expansion in the Roman Empire, no other nation really had a similar God. So they were looked at as really having unusual teachings. And between the Greeks and the Romans, the Egyptians had a bit of a concept of God that might be a little better, but the other nationalities, the other nations were pagan, and the way that they saw God was kind of God the enforcer, God who had to be appeased. Think about it, the ancient Romans, when they had problems, so they blamed the Christians. They said, well, this is because the Christians are not worshiping our gods, and so the gods are angry. And that would be then used to persecute Christians. And, but this experience, that's why the God of Israel, the God of Jesus Christ, is definitely a unique experience of God. It is not something that we find in other religious traditions. And that was, I think it also helped some of the pagan nations to come to a clarity in their own spiritual journey, where things made more sense, and their sense of religious faith and fervor, just became that of legends, because it just really did not make sense. And they applied concepts perhaps of, kingdom and power, but without any real relationship with God, a relationship that is predicated on love, that is predicated on relating as opposed to fearing or other expressions. Okay, next week we're going to have the next 2 Wednesdays will be focused on the Nativity itself, and next week we'll look a little bit more at some of the biblical background around the Nativity, both some of the stuff out of the Old Testament, as well as then specifically from the gospel tradition, and how it impacts our understanding of the feast. We'll also get into the development of feast. So the whole idea of, well, is Christmas really, was Jesus born on the 25th of December or not? So we'll get into some of that too. And then the following week, we're going to go through some of the earliest depictions of both the Nativity as well as the mother and child. The Nativity appears in the catacombs. So it is one of those events. For example, the resurrection doesn't appear in the catacombs, but the Nativity does. And that doesn't have to do with the fact that, it's not that they didn't believe in the resurrection. It's that the Nativity of Christ was much more understandable. So it was something that could be expressed and painted. And that makes, and I think also the importance of the cultivating that awareness of God becoming a human being, that incarnation being such a foundational point of encounter with God. So that makes it easier to depict. And I will share with you some of these depictions, and we can analyze them and learn from them. So that, because I think that's one of the things. Christian art is not decorative. Christian art is catechetical. It teaches faith. And so, and that's what I'd like to emphasize when we do look at these early depictions of the Nativity of Christ. Okay? Okay, we'll see you next week.